Spring 1945. Northern Germany lies silent beneath a pale gray sky. Smoke still rises from the skeletal remains of what were once family homes. Roofs are gone, windows shattered. Streets are lined with bricks and dust, the color of defeat. A cold wind carries the scent of ashes and hunger. In the distance, engines hum, not the thunder of tanks, but the low grind of British trucks. Civilians freeze, expecting soldiers with rifles. Instead, they see men in khaki unloading timber, nails, and sacks of flour. One soldier kneels beside a half-collapsed wall, lifting bricks with steady hands. Another offers a child a biscuit wrapped in brown paper. A German woman watches from the ruins, her face marked by fear and disbelief. For years, she was told these men were monsters. Yet, here they are, repairing her roof, rebuilding her street, feeding her children. No one speaks. Only the sound of hammering echoes through the empty town. Steady, rhythmic, human. No one expected this. Not mercy, not rebuilding, from the very men they had been taught to fear. By April 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to its bloody end. Adolf Hitler's Reich, once proclaimed to last 1,000 years, had been reduced to rubble in less than 12. Entire cities lay in ruin. Hamburg burned black from the firestorms of 1943, Hanover's skyline flattened by Allied bombs, and Bremen left as a ghost port along the river Weser. Trains no longer ran. Fields lay untended. Roads were choked with refugees, the old, the wounded, the orphaned, all drifting through the ashes of their nation. Germany was starving. Infrastructure had collapsed. Bridges were blown, factories destroyed, and farms stripped bare by retreating troops. Millions had no shelter, no food, and no hope. In towns across the north, church bells that once marked Sunday worship were now melted fragments among the ruins. When British forces advanced into northern Germany in late April, they encountered not an army, but a nation in shock. The Wehrmacht had dissolved, local governments vanished, and lawlessness crept through the countryside. The British 21st Army Group, under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, took control of vast territories from Schleswig-Holstein and Hamburg to Lower Saxony. But victory brought a different kind of challenge. Montgomery's men were not facing soldiers anymore. They were facing civilians, hollow-eyed, displaced, desperate. Cholera and typhus threatened to spread through makeshift refugee camps. Thousands of children wandered alone, separated from parents killed or captured. The newly established British military government found itself in charge of millions of defeated Germans, including prisoners, refugees, and civilians. Their first order was not punishment, it was survival. British command understood that if Germany starved, Europe itself would rot with it. So, amid the smoldering ruins, a new mission began: to restore order, deliver food, and rebuild enough shelter to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe before winter. Soldiers who had spent years destroying bridges now received orders to rebuild them. This was the beginning of an unexpected transformation, one that would turn conquerors into caretakers and enemies into unlikely allies. When the fighting ended, most Germans expected retribution. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the British and Americans as ruthless occupiers who would burn, loot, and kill in vengeance. Civilians whispered that Allied soldiers would take their homes, their daughters, and their lives. Fear lingered in every basement and air raid shelter long after the gunfire had stopped. But the reality that unfolded in the British zone was profoundly different. Instead of revenge, the British military government enforced discipline, restraint, and, most surprisingly, compassion. Orders from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery were clear. The war is over. Our task now is to restore order and prevent disease and famine. He understood that peace could not exist on hunger and humiliation. Under Montgomery's direction, the Control Commission for Germany, British Element, was created. Its officers, a mix of soldiers, civil servants, engineers, and doctors, began the immense task of rebuilding a nation from the ruins of its own war. The focus shifted from combat operations to reconstruction and relief. British units that once advanced under artillery fire were now distributing food, restoring power, and reopening water systems. One of the first priorities was housing. Thousands of German families were sleeping in cellars, railway wagons, or the shells of bombed-out buildings. British engineers supervised the clearing of rubble and provided timber and nails to rebuild basic shelters. Field kitchens were established in towns like Hamburg, Lübeck, and Hanover, serving soup and bread to starving civilians, many of whom had once cheered the Luftwaffe that bombed London. To control disease, medical teams set up emergency clinics. The British also launched child welfare programs, feeding thousands of undernourished children daily. Schools were gradually reopened, and teachers were retrained under strict denazification guidelines to remove Nazi ideology from education. Every act, from rebuilding a bridge to feeding a child, carried immense symbolic weight. It wasn't just reconstruction, it was redemption. The British occupation strategy aimed not only to stabilize Germany, but also to rebuild its moral foundation. Slowly, rumors spread among German civilians. The British soldiers were not here to destroy, but to rebuild. It was the first time many realized that mercy, too, could follow victory. The human angle. When the British arrived, most German civilians expected the worst. They hid behind curtains, clutching what little remained of their possessions. Many had lost everything: homes, families, and dignity. In the shattered towns of northern Germany, silence ruled the first days of occupation. Then came an unexpected sound: the thud of hammers. British soldiers, once the enemy, began clearing rubble and repairing rooftops. At first, the sight stunned the civilians. Some refused to believe it, convinced it was a cruel trick. But as days passed, fear began to soften into disbelief, and disbelief into gratitude. A woman in Lübeck later recalled, "They gave us food before asking for anything. I thought I would die of shame and relief at the same time." Such moments reshaped the very meaning of victory. For many Germans, the kindness of British soldiers was harder to comprehend than defeat itself. The military angle for the British command, reconstruction, was not merely charity. It was strategy. Montgomery and his officers recognized that chaos breeds rebellion. Germany in 1945 was fragile. If left to starve, it could easily collapse into anarchy or fall under Soviet influence. Thus, rebuilding became a matter of security as much as morality. Military engineers, supply officers, and medical corps were redirected toward stabilization efforts. "We must feed them, or they will perish, and with them, Europe's future," wrote one British officer in a post-war report. The moral angle among soldiers, victory had brought no joy. After years of bombings, death, and destruction, many asked themselves what it truly meant to win. They had defeated an enemy, but what remained of humanity? The ruins of German towns mirrored their own weariness. For young soldiers who had seen friends die from Normandy to the Rhine, helping civilians offered a rare sense of peace. A corporal wrote home, "For the first time, I feel like I'm fighting for something worth saving." The moral weight of victory began to shift, from punishment to restoration, from hate to empathy. And in that shift, a new kind of strength emerged, one built not on domination, but on rebuilding what war had destroyed. The technological, logistical angle rebuilding, a broken nation required more than goodwill. It demanded organization, machinery, and discipline. The British Army possessed all three. Units that had once laid pontoon bridges under enemy fire now turned their expertise toward civil reconstruction. The Royal Engineers became the backbone of recovery across the British occupation zone. Their first task, reconnecting towns cut off by bombed bridges and blocked railways. Portable Bailey bridges, the same lightweight, modular structures that carried tanks across the Rhine, were now used to span rivers and restore civilian travel. Military workshops that had repaired armored vehicles were converted into sawmills, cutting timber for new housing. Field depots distributed nails, roofing materials, and concrete. Within months, entire blocks of makeshift homes rose where only rubble had stood. This wasn't a spontaneous act of kindness. It was a methodical operation, guided by the same precision that had once won battles. The tools of war had become the instruments of renewal. The psychological angle for British soldiers, rebuilding brought unexpected healing. Many had endured years of destruction. Normandy's beaches, Arnhem's bridges, the long march into Germany. Now, working among civilians, they rediscovered a sense of purpose that battle had taken away. Helping children find shoes or repairing a family's home reminded them that war's end could also mean the restoration of normal life. German civilians, too, began to change. Suspicion faded as they saw soldiers share their rations, smile at their children, or stop to fix a leaking roof. Trust, fragile as glass, began to form between those who had once tried to kill each other. The cultural angle beyond bricks and bridges, small gestures spoke volumes. British troops often shared tea, a rare comfort, with German families. Locals offered whatever they had: apples, bread, sometimes just gratitude. Language barriers remained, but laughter became a universal translation. Music returned to some villages as British bands played for mixed crowds. Football matches were organized between soldiers and locals, marking the first friendly encounters between former enemies. Each act, however small, carried meaning. It said, "The war is over, and we are human again." What began as duty slowly became mutual respect. A quiet peace built one conversation, one repaired home, one shared meal at a time. May 1945. The war in Europe was over, but in northern Germany, the peace felt colder than winter. In the outskirts of Hamburg, the smell of smoke still lingered. A city once alive with industry and music now stood as a wasteland of twisted metal and scorched stone. Civilians emerged from basements and cellars, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. The British had entered the city, and no one knew what to expect. Many feared retribution. For years, Nazi propaganda had warned that the Allies would show no mercy. Mothers hid their daughters. Old men trembled at the sight of khaki uniforms moving through the ruins. When British trucks rolled down shattered streets, people watched in silence, waiting for anger, punishment, or confiscation. But what followed was something none of them imagined. Instead of soldiers shouting orders, they saw men unloading timber and tools. British Royal Engineers, who only weeks earlier had crossed the Rhine under enemy fire, were now stacking planks beside burned-out houses. Within hours, the sound of hammering filled the air where gunfire once echoed. At a school near Altona, a group of soldiers began clearing debris. Chalkboards were still covered in wartime slogans. A British sergeant, barely 25, ordered his men to save the desks. "We'll need them soon," he said quietly. Children watched from doorways, too frightened to come close. Then one soldier offered a biscuit. Another found a ragged German flag in the rubble and folded it carefully, placing it aside without contempt. Slowly, the tension began to break. By June, the same soldiers were helping locals raise wooden walls and patch shattered roofs. Civilians who had been taught to hate them now worked beside them, handing nails, carrying boards, sweeping dust. For the first time in years, there was cooperation, the smallest form of peace. The transformation of Hamburg's outskirts became symbolic of a larger change sweeping through the British zone. War had ended with surrender, but peace, true peace, began with the rebuilding of a single home. Across the British zone, from Lübeck to Hanover, similar scenes unfolded through the summer of 1945. The Royal Engineers and Pioneer Corps worked side by side with German civilians, transforming devastation into recovery. Their operations were meticulous, guided not by military tactics, but by compassion shaped through discipline. In Lübeck, British units repaired bridges across the Trave River, using the same Bailey Bridge technology that had carried tanks into battle only months before. Now, those same structures carried bread trucks, water tankers, and children walking to reopen schools. Local records describe the astonishment of townspeople. We expected boots and rifles. Instead, they brought ropes and ladders. In Bremen, engineers restored power to the harbor area, allowing ships carrying food and medicine to dock again. At every site, German civilians volunteered to help, many still wearing torn Wehrmacht uniforms or Red Cross armbands. For every plank laid, there was an unspoken exchange. Forgiveness given quietly, trust rebuilt one gesture at a time. British officers noted the change. Major Peter Latham of the Royal Engineers wrote in his diary, "It is the oddest thing, to rebuild the homes we once destroyed. Yet, the faces of the children make it worth every hour." Another entry from a civilian report reads, "The British soldier is no longer our enemy. He is the one who helps us find bread." The symbolic power of these moments reached its height when, in one small village near Celle, a convoy of British trucks entered, carrying building materials. Dozens of children ran out, waving pieces of white cloth as makeshift flags. Not in surrender this time, but in welcome. A sergeant leaned from his cab and tossed chocolate bars into the crowd. Laughter followed, echoing through streets where silence and sorrow had reigned for years. By late July 1945, hundreds of houses and dozens of schools had been made livable again in the British zone. The engineers' work restored more than structures. It restored faith. The same soldiers who had come to conquer now stood side by side with the conquered, rebuilding not just walls, but the fragile bridge between nations. By the autumn of 1945, the landscape of northern Germany was changing, not just physically, but emotionally. The ruins still stood like scars across the land, but among them rose new beams of timber, new roofs of slate, and the faint hum of recovered life. The villages once ghostly silent began to sound again with hammers, laughter, and the chatter of children. The war had ended, but what followed felt like something no one expected. Reconciliation through rebuilding. British authorities, now governing the zone through the Control Commission for Germany, British element, Sekinti, began to document progress with surprising speed. Within 6 months, more than 250,000 temporary homes were repaired or made habitable again. Thousands of displaced families and refugees from the East, many fleeing the advancing Soviets, found shelter in British-administered camps and restored villages. Food was scarce across Europe, yet the British military government shared rations equitably with the German civilian population. In towns like Hamburg and Kiel, British soldiers handed out tinned meat, powdered milk, and bread to children. One report recorded that each German received roughly 200 calories per day, often the same ration as British troops. Beyond housing and food, the British also revived public services, re-establishing postal systems, opening local councils under careful supervision, and even helping to restart schools. Teachers who had been vetted for Nazi ties were reinstated. Churches reopened, markets returned, and in many towns, the Union Jack flew beside the white flag of surrender as a symbol not of conquest, but of shared endurance. A striking feature of this period was the spirit of cooperation that emerged between former enemies. German engineers, farmers, and ordinary citizens began working alongside British occupation troops, rebuilding infrastructure, clearing debris, and restoring farmland. In Bremen, German laborers worked under British oversight to repair the bombed docks, enabling vital food imports. In Hanover, women known as Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, cleared bricks and stones shoulder to shoulder with British military units. The early months of this cooperation transformed the perception of the occupiers. Fear began to fade, replaced by gratitude and cautious respect. One civilian diary from Hamburg reads, "They came with weapons, but stayed with compassion. We no longer feared the British. We trusted them to keep us alive." By the year's end, the British occupation zone, home to nearly 22 million Germans, was no longer defined by punishment or hostility, but by the quiet, daily work of survival and rebuilding. A fragile peace was taking root, nourished by the very soldiers who had once been the enemy. The months that followed revealed something deeper than reconstruction. They marked the rebirth of Germany's moral and civic foundation, guided in part by British policy and example. What began as a military occupation evolved into a social experiment. Could compassion rebuild a defeated nation faster than control or vengeance? By 1946, the British Control Commission shifted its mission from stabilization to democratization. Under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and later General Brian Robertson, the British pushed for local self-governance, independent media, and the re-education of German citizens. Newspapers reopened under Allied supervision, teaching values of accountability and free speech. Town councils were reformed with civilian members who had no Nazi past. Even schools were redesigned to emphasize democratic thinking, civic duty, and moral reflection. The results were slow, but undeniable. Within a few years, the British zone had become a model of post-war recovery, not just materially, but ethically. It laid the groundwork for what would become the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. The idea that democracy and order could coexist with mercy took firm root here, long before Berlin was rebuilt or NATO was formed. On the ground, civilians felt the change firsthand. Where hatred and fear once ruled, cooperation began to define everyday life. Farmers sold produce to British mess halls. German carpenters rebuilt barracks for occupation troops. Children who had once hidden from Allied bombers now waved at the passing British convoys, mimicking their salutes. One British officer later wrote, "We realized that our greatest victory was not over the Wehrmacht, but over the bitterness that war had sown." For German civilians, this victory of the heart was even greater. Many began to see the occupying soldiers not as conquerors, but as guardians of peace, protectors who had chosen restraint over revenge. The humanitarian tone of the British zone also influenced later European cooperation. By the early 1950s, West Germany and the United Kingdom stood side by side in NATO. Transformation almost unthinkable in 1945. The moral groundwork laid in those first post-war years had become the foundation of a new alliance built on mutual trust, not fear. In the ruins of war, mercy had proven to be a stronger architect than hate. The rebuilding of northern Germany was more than an act of survival. It was a quiet revolution of conscience, where the victors chose humanity over humiliation, and in doing so, helped their former enemies find a way back to the light. It is early morning, mist curling over roofs rebuilt from the ashes. The sound of hammers is gone now, replaced by birdsong and the distant laughter of children running through the same streets where tanks once rolled. A British soldier, older now, leans against a wooden fence, watching the village breathe again. He does not speak. He simply listens to life returning. In the courtyard, a woman sweeps the dust from her doorstep. Beside her, A child plants small flowers in the soil, where once there were craters. The air is clean, carrying the faint scent of bread baking in a new oven. The war feels like another lifetime, though the ruins at the edge of town still whisper what was lost. The camera pulls back further, over the rooftops, over the green fields stitched with quiet rivers, over the places where mercy took root. No parades marked this victory, no flags waved, but in the silence that followed the guns, something greater rose, the decision to build, not to burn. For every brick lifted, every loaf shared, every moment of restraint, a bridge was built not just between nations, but between hearts that had forgotten how to trust. And as Europe slowly found its voice again, it began with gestures like these, small, human, and unseen by history books. The final image holds on the village. Children laughing in the sunlight, a British jeep rumbling away down a dirt road. In the ashes of war, mercy rebuilt more than homes. It rebuilt the soul of a continent.